Why do people commit themselves to the things they do? Why are people so worried about sport? Why wine? Why video games? I'm Brian Lowry, and in this season of my podcast, Know What You See, I'm asking a simple question, but a really big one. What's the point? In conversations with people with a variety of passions and obsessions, we get the chance to look through a window and see what it means to truly focus on a realm of human experience. Join me on Know What You See. New episodes begin November 26th.
Hello friends, Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Makoto Fujimura. Mako was on one of our live shows maybe a decade ago here in Nashville, and I had been looking for an opportunity to sit down with him and spend some more time with him. So recently, on a trip to New York City, went up there to get several interviews, and Mako generously agreed to welcome us to his studio. And it was a delightful afternoon and evening. I made my way up by subway and bus over across the Hudson River and made my way to Mako's studio. Sophie Byard came in as well from Nashville to tape the interview, and it was a lovely time. As I say in the interview, I got there early to sit with one of Mako's pieces, very large abstract painting that, as he discusses, is a product of a particular Japanese traditional painting technique. And it became a meditative, even prayerful experience, I would say, sitting there with that painting for probably half an hour or more. I didn't allow myself to look at the watch while I was sitting there, and the time passed beautifully and wonderfully. Lovely conversation. So grateful for Mako and the work that he's doing in the world. Afterwards, we had a wonderful time going to a dinner. We went to a Japanese-Korean fusion restaurant with Mako and his wife, and asked Mako just to order dinner for us. And it was fantastic. It was really delightful. Hope you enjoy this conversation with Makoto Fujimura. Makoto Fujimura is a leading contemporary artist known for his slow art, merging traditional Japanese techniques with abstract expressionism. His work, described by the New York Times as, quote, a small rebellion against the quickening of time, end quote, is exhibited in major galleries and museums worldwide. Mako is a former member of the National Council on the Arts and received the American Academy of Religion's Religion and the Arts Award for his contributions to bridging art and faith. He's the founder of the International Arts Movement and has authored several influential books, including Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. Today, we're here in his gallery in Fort Lee, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Mako, thanks for having us.
It's great to have you here.
Yeah, nice to see you again. We got to be together in Nashville, I don't know, maybe a decade ago.
But, I think so, yeah. But it was, I still remember that.
Yeah,
so
nice to see you again.
Yes,
so thanks for having us.
Yeah.
I would love for you, here we are in your beautiful gallery, and would you perhaps introduce Nihonga to us?
Nihonga is Japanese painting, directly translated, and it was a term coined in early 20th century, a little earlier than that. In Japan, it was Meiji era, where Western culture was coming in at very rapid pace, and this Harvard professor of art history who loved Japan was teaching in Japan, coined this term to distinguish Japanese paintings from Western paintings. And so there's Nihonga and Yoga. These were two words created then to really try to preserve this ancient way of painting that has been refined over time. It came through the Silk Road, and Japan was the end of Silk Road. So in many ways, the technique of painting that is known in 17th century was called Rinpa style, that became, if you go to any major museums, they would have 17th century screens done in exact the same material that I use behind me. And you typically done on paper and silk, and I call it slow art. Somebody called it slow art because it is literally creating pigments and mixture of paint yourself. So you control all the elements. Pigments are pulverized by generations of artisans who serve Nihonga in Japan. And so there's an ecosystem of paper makers, silk makers, brush makers, pigment shop owners that I get to be part of that ecosystem to carry on that tradition. But in my case, it's in contemporary art. So I'm bringing that slow art to contemporary art genre.
Now I understand that you may do a great number of layers, and then you have to wait as they dry.
Right. So sometimes over 100 to 150 layers before I start painting an image, and that's part of the meditative quality of what I do, which appeals to me. It is something that I actually drew me to this tradition as a student, that it is not buying tubes, it's tubes of paint in art store and then have this immediate fast drying technique, but it's slow, and it's also mutable. The pigments will settle over time, and so some of the works will use silver will tarnish over time, and that's part of the calculation of Nihonga is you're actually capturing time itself. And the slowness of it is also a way to reveal something about qualities of our lives that is captured in the layers of painting.
Now, you say this meditative quality appeals to you. So would you describe for us a bit more, what's the process like for you? Right. In what way is it meditative for you?
Right. So we live in the very fast-paced world with technology, and where productivity and efficiency has so become part of the natural rhythm. And so we don't really stop anymore. It's like going to A to Z very fast, and there are certainly advantages of that. But I've always found, especially digital technology, to be dehumanizing, or at least it doesn't allow you to capture the full senses of what human beings are capable of getting to know the world through our senses. And so when I encounter Nihonga materials and technique, I immediately something clicked in me that I recognized that our sensory perceptions have far more capacities than this flat image that we are always creating on digital imagery. And in some ways, my work stands as a kind of an antidote toward this fast-paced, flat image making. And especially now with AI coming into play, it's also something that we have lost in that quickening of time in digital imagery and artificial intelligence creating images. Anybody can create images now. So I do the opposite. I kind of make art that you can't really, if you would take, iPhone photo of this, it would completely not work. In some of the images, the layers are done in such a way that if you, and I have people try it, try taking a photo of my work, and they're just astonished because what's happening is the refractive element, the prismatic elements of the surface of my work. Your eye can see it, and will read it as blue, or green, or whatever the color may be. But when you use digital technology, the mechanism will take that away. So it looks completely gray. And people are like, how could this be? This is my iPhone. I just got this. And I say, well, digital technology is great for certain things, like taking portraits and flowers. But it is not good at finding that in between gap of perception. that we all are capable of seeing, and oftentimes beauty comes through those gaps.
So I wanted us to set up here for those who are just listening and can't see. We're sitting in front of a beautiful piece. That's what, maybe how large?
It'll be about 7 by 12 feet, maybe something like that. Yeah.
And so when I came into this gallery space, it immediately caught my attention. And this was earlier this afternoon, and I had the place to myself. And so I took a chair and I sat here about maybe 8 feet away from it. And I thought, I'm just gonna sit. And after about 15 minutes, then I moved the chair to about 2 feet away. And I didn't look at my watch the whole time. And it was about 30 minutes. Oh. And I found myself in this sort of meditative place where I found myself breathing very deeply. I also felt some pressure, I think, in my chest, and then I would breathe deeply and get back into a meditative state. And then it was sitting with it where I began to see all sorts of things that I could not see without sitting with it for quite some time. Yes. It was a remarkable experience. Wow. And then in a book that about your work that was sitting here on this bench later, I read where one commentator said, "The unfinished character of art is an invitation to the viewer to participate in the work itself. The epoch of Fujimura is characterized by political and spiritual crisis, one of the chief symptoms of which is amnesia about the animating ideals of human life. One of the goals of the art of Fujimura is to cultivate in viewers the art of remembering. The experience is meditative, if not prayerful." And I found it remarkable that he was describing exactly what I had experienced while I was sitting here. But how do you react to that? What does that resonate with you, of one of the things that you hope for? Or how do you think, as someone doing abstract expressionism, what you hope will happen in a viewer?
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. I desire for people to slow down themselves, to take in my work, because you don't really see it for a while. And I just did a museum show at Pepperdine University, and there's a beautiful museum there. And the curator kindly posted, you must commit to sitting in front of one of these paintings, otherwise you will miss it, and I was really thankful. And just to explain what's happening in this piece behind us is a golden piece, which invokes the Rimpa screens of 17th century, using gold. And in many cases, the gold is layered. Japanese gold is the thinnest, microscopically thin, very hard to use. But one of the ways is to, gild with multiple gold. So there's 5 layers of gold right behind me. And then there's pigments underneath, which is very gestural in this case, done on the largest paper at the time that was created in Japan. And this paper is very special because it is basically extinct. The paper maker passed away. The size is still available, but it's not as consistent. So I remember getting this batch of rolled paper in mid-90s and thinking, well, this is the last batch. What am I going to do? And in mid-2000, when Willem de Kooning, one of the great giants of abstract expressionism, passed away, I wanted to do a piece in homage of him. And piece here, my piece is called Charis, and it's Charis is Greek for grace. And I wanted that layering of minerals and the flattening of gilded gold to speak of the mystery of how really, even though gold will flatten the surface, it creates more depth, right? So, but you will not see it because it's reflective, and the light reflects the light. So you don't see the depth of it until your eyes adjust and you start to, our minds are trained to categorize things. So when we see blue painting, we say, oh, that's a blue painting. There's nothing there. Or gold painting, there's nothing there. But once you slow down, as you experience, you see the layers, and your eyes actually are already ahead of the mind that continues to shut down perception. So, your eyes are basically part of the brain. So if you relax and if you open your eyes, you see miraculous images everywhere, actually. Burning bushes everywhere. But it takes time for most of us. And so your experience of moving from a distance to close is oftentimes the case. People are drawn into the work, and they see things like, wait, how could that be? Is it the same painting? Kind of experience. And then they start to really enjoy the work.
So, I'm just a good old boy from Alabama. I don't understand high art and abstract expressionism. And so I wonder sometimes, is the experience of a viewer of abstract expressionism, do you think that they're seeing more of themselves, or are they seeing what the artist wants them to see?
Great artists are great and enduring because they are able to capture something about what the audience bring in their work. Now, so a Rothko painting painted in 1955. The reason why his paintings are so valued today is because the more people see it, the more they are able to bring in generatively through the work. Somehow it becomes a portal. And the imagination, Van Gogh's Starry Night, it's millions of people see that every day. And those of us who have seen it maybe 100 times, we'll continue to find some newness in it. And so artists are aware of this, because they are painting toward an audience. Some artists are very reclusive in their way of avoiding that in certain ways, to be disciplined about not reacting to an audience. But artists like Mark Rothko would always talk about what he wanted the audience to experience was not his expression. It was a mystery of reality, or some kind of a way that the audience can enter into what is really valuable in human experience. And so he was very aware of this. And so many artists, William de Kooning included, would be, really would be very much wanting that audience maybe 100 years later, they were anticipating that their work will continue to generate, speak meaning into the time that is not theirs.
May I share with you some of the things I saw? So you're talking about the depth. I didn't see the fullness of the depth until I moved closer. And then there was something about the bottom part here that I started seeing. To me, it seemed like at the bottom it was more close to me. And then as I moved up, it was a little lower in the levels. But then it struck me like this was some sort of apocalyptic unveiling. And then once I began to consider that, then of course in the top left, there's the more bold red, which reminded me of the bloodstains of history, and that's always central to some sort of apocalyptic unveiling. And yet that's not the predominant note either. And there's all sorts of other colors and beauty. And then I began, as I had moved very closely, I began to see the tiny brilliant flex that, of course, in my mind, conjured the notion of the many millions, billions of moments of brilliance and beauty in human history. And then the last thing I'll mention briefly is that there's also this kind of structure throughout. Mm-hmm. And so I began to wonder, as the structure is clearly more unveiled here than down below. And so I began to wonder, is the structure something that has been imposed on history, or is it central to history? So anyway, those are some of the things that I began to see, and I thought, wow. How could this do that? How can your art affect such things? And of course, I suppose that's particular to me, right? But it does something for me in that way.
Yeah. And there is a sense in which what I was trying to do is resonating with what you just said, because the layers of gold that is heavily, the 5 layers actually is on the bottom. So it reads as flat, but it's the heaviest part. So I'm not surprised that you were drawn to it first. Mm-hmm. And then the impossibility of this painting is that you're drawing up from the heavy side to the sky, basically, or the upper portion, which is more gestural. There's so minerals, as you noted, they are coarse minerals, not finely ground, but sand-like. So you do see the refractive, prismatic, and they are pretty pronounced, but you don't see it at first because our eyes are reading the gold. Mm-hmm. And as your eyes travel upward, you do see, hopefully, transcendence of that, but also dissonance, right? The gold is layered in a staggered way so that the orderly grids are disturbed. And in between, you see the gesture underneath. So you end up kind of literally confused. Apocalyptic is a good word in terms of it. The underneath reveals itself, right? And of course, gold to me is, as I think about the use of this material, gold has always been a symbol of divinity in all cultures. And because of the transparency of fine gold, it allows you to do certain things that no other material can really do, which is to create a mirror-like surface, and yet you can see through it. So if you use fine gold, close to pure as possible, then you're going to be able to do things visually that materialize it would be impossible to do. So thinking about William de Kooning and the history of abstract expressionism and the critiques of gestures is that it was too human in a way, that critical critics talked about how he needs to be more flat. and my friend and colleague Takashi Murakami, who is probably the most famous artist, Japanese artist of our time. His book is called Super Flat because modernity and postmodernity and beyond has sought this perfectly mirror-like super flatness, which can be captured in AI and, and digital media very well, right? So it translates into that world and therefore you have more communication perhaps happening through little, screens. But see, de Kooning was going the opposite direction, I believe. And he intentionally pushed back against these critical voices that says he needs to be more flat, blah, blah, blah. And he was longing for this gestural mystery that he felt was happening with his paint and what he was painting. And for me, that's fascinating. You know, there's this gap between the ideal and the reality of an artist's soul. And what I wanted to do was create a flat image, in a sense, right? To create something only gold can do, but then honor him by saying, but this is not really flat, and it's actually dimensionless, you know, and it brings the transcendence into what we think is flat, right? What we perhaps struggle with, but maybe we're comfortable in that world of where, you know, everything is determined with certainty that this is that. And I'm trying to push that, you know, push against that as an artist. So it's kind of a multi-balanced conversation.
So you've begun to allude to this, but in about a decade ago, you received a Religion in the Arts award, and in your speech of receiving that award, you suggested that there's this contemporary schism between faith and art, and that even the notion of having an award such as that perhaps posited what you see as a problem. That is this presumption that there's some sort of schism between faith and art. And you say, even today with such a schism, people hunger for this integration between faith and art. One of the directors of the New York galleries with which I have been associated, who does not share my religious convictions, once said to me, all great art is religious. And then in a video on your work, there's a gallery owner who's commenting about your work, and she says, there's a line in the contemporary art world. You can paint and you can worship, but don't do them together. If you step over that line, you're in essence setting yourself up for crucifixion. So talk to us about this division and how you're trying to refuse to accept that dichotomy.
Right. And I, grew up in a very much an agnostic. My father was a scientist, a pure researcher, and my mother an educator. And I didn't know that her parents were leaders in an underground Christian church, but I only discovered that later. So I grew up not really having any kind of religious convictions, or I didn't go to church. So when I came to faith, it was through reading William Blake. It was. I was in my mid-20s, and I was reading his epic poem, Jerusalem, his last epic poem, some 400 pages long. I waded through this thing because I wanted to ask that question about what is the reality that I am not seeing, which I was convinced existed. But, and artists are always hinting at that, whether religious artists or not, they're always hinting at this, either in denial of that or acceptance of that. So artists like Gorky or Rothko dived right in, right? So they knew that the weight of the invisible realities were propelling them to do their work. So talk about integration. I mean, they really lived in that zone. William Blake obviously spoke directly about experience of seeing Jesus, and he would describe this encounter as really honest dialogue, asking God about huge questions of humanity. So at the end of Jerusalem, out beyond his emanation or his main symbol of humanity, comes at the foot of the cross. Jesus is there on the cross and says, "O Lord, my selfhood cruel marches against thee, deceitful to meet thee in my pride." And when I read that, I was like, that's it. I understand this. There's something cruel operating inside of me that even though I want to be a good person, I want to be, I want to work toward at least being able to love others and love myself. But there's something mitigating against that. And up to that point, I thought it was something that I can learn to master, right? But I never realized that there was this directionality to even my own heart that would work against God in that sense. And so I'll be on looking up at Jesus and saying, what do I do about this? Right? And Jesus answers from the cross, says, Albion, fear not, unless I die, thou cannot live. But if I die, thou should arise with me. And he asks this question. He says, wouldst thou love one who never died for thee, or ever love one who has not died for thee? It is in essence this way of understanding sacrifice is what Jesus did on the cross. The cross was to give himself so that he defined what love was. That love is sacrifice. That love will liberate us from that bondage that we find ourselves, being cruel toward others, cruel toward ourselves. And when I read that, I felt something click in me that, because since childhood, whenever I'm painting, I experience this flow, and I would tell my mom about it. I had this experience of something going through me. I knew it wasn't mine. I knew I didn't own that. I knew it was a gift. But I thought everybody had that experience. So until middle school, right? You don't talk about this with your friends playing soccer, and then you kind of, learn to shut up and not tell anybody. And then it was in college that I finally said to myself, well, what's really important to you? Like, what do you want to do? If you could do anything, what do you find yourself doing? And then, I found myself painting. But asking these questions. So when I going back to the art faith divide, I never had that. And when I became a Christian, right, when I began to go to church and listen to people, I found this divide. They were preaching this divide, and I was, in a sense, with their lives, if not, on pulpit. And, this culture wars language was starting to build up even in the early 90s. And why would this be at this junction when I felt in my bones when I was painting this connection flowing through me? And of course, that voice of Jesus that Blake introduced me to is Gospel of John. And when I read the Gospel of John, I know that that's the voice that I sensed as a child. And it was so distinct that I realized this is it. I have now a name for my experience. And so I came to realize, oh, okay, so I can't really talk about my faith and, with my artist friends, and I can't talk about art with my Christian friends because they, both sides divided the two, right? But for me, it's never been that way. So when I received that award, when I began to articulate some of that, or given the chance to, perhaps it was the first time I said out loud what I always felt was my experience.
At one point, you say, I don't remember the context for this, but you indicated that at times atheists seem to understand what you're up to better than theists. Mm-hmm. Why is that, you think?
Well, if you are a committed atheist, you have very thoughtful arguments against theism. And because of that, it's kind of a mirroring of theism. They know what they're denying. And I have learned so much by listening to atheists, point out things about what they don't believe, right? But from a perspective of, well, let's say theists who haven't gone through the discipline of thinking about their faith, and I find their arguments towards theism not as credible. And so I love listening to people with convictions, people who are thoughtful and have, and the best of them are, can dwell in the realm of mystery still. And so there in that mystery zone, I am having a fellowship. It doesn't matter what you claim to be. We can stand in front of a Rothko painting together and weep. So I think that's the sense in where oftentimes Christians typically tend to have certainty about reality that is not warranted by their theology. It's a leap that we tend to make without thinking through what we believe. So that's perhaps what I mean by that statement.
Hello, friends. This month's NSC Plus experiment will help you focus your life on some things that matter.
That's right. Lee, myself, and our guest this month, former Radiolab and This American Life producer Bethel Hapty, spend some time discussing what we want our lives to look like if we knew we only had 3 years to live.
And it's a very helpful exercise that we'd love to share with you. And this month, our new experiment is all about, which I'm pretty stoked about, is all about singing together. Should old acquaintance be forgot?
So please join us on No Small Endeavor Plus. Not only will it be like a warm hug from myself and Lee, but you'll also get an ad-free listening experience plus early access to our live shows.
So go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus, and let's experiment with what it means to live a good life together. One last subpoint on this consideration of this divide. You say, to this day, I count it as my privilege to get to know brothers and sisters in communities that many evangelical leaders have labeled as plagues to avoid. You want to unpack that for us just a bit?
And there's so much today, especially divide in culture, demonizing the other side as this and that, and they come to threaten us, and perhaps that's the experience. But because I'm an artist, I dwell in the margins, and I get to hear voices of those who, even very early on in my journey, articulating things that are very true and authentic, and that the credibility of their experience is just as valuable as anybody else. And when you see someone who has been traumatized by the church, grew up in the South. Many artists grew up in areas where they grew up in the church. And we have these conversations, and they are very much anti-Christian sentiment because of what they experienced. And when we begin to uncover what that is, I'm like, I would be atheist if I went through that. I'm so sorry, you know, and so in many cases we label the other, and it happens from their side too, you know. So we may criticize conservatives for this and that, and we have set notions of what those people stand for, and I can't believe, and I bring, in some cases I literally will intentionally bring my conservative friends with my artist friends and just have a dinner, and at the end of the time you end up with, oh, I didn't know that about what you believe, or thank you for sharing your heart, because, I can think of so many ways where my relationship with this other person or, my upbringing has led me to believe in this entrenched view where perhaps that was wrong. So these are always fluid conversations, and I don't think in any particular case that there's not a person who is perhaps entrenched in their views, but with given time, there's bound to be openness, because we are all at the end of the day not quite sure what tomorrow brings, and we need each other to discover those things.
Kintsugi.
Yes.
Another significant art form for you. Would you unpack that for us a bit?
Right. So Kintsugi form comes out of Urushi tradition, Japan lacquer tradition. And when I was at Tokyo University of the Arts studying Nihonga, I had many friends who were, their major was Urushi, and this is quite amazing. When you enter Urushi discipline as a freshman in this university, you have to go through 6 months of basically immunizing yourself from this poison sumac material. And some of them don't make it. So,
Do you mean some of them die?
No, some of them don't they don't develop immunity, so they can't continue as Urushi master. They do something else, But 1/3 will end up leaving this discipline. And I had a friend who made it through, and so I learned a lot from him. And he was talking about Kintsugi back then. It was relatively unknown form, but this is tradition of repairing broken ceramics, but to make something more valuable than before it broke, which is to use urushi, which is actually very expensive, and gold. So you may have a noodle bowl from 17th century Korea that was used in high tea in Japan that somehow broke during an earthquake, and families of tea masters will hold on to the fragments for generations sometimes, and then the urushi master will mend it, which means that the bowl originally might have been 10 cents and you're spending thousands of dollars to mend this because of the significance of the story behind what this bowl represented and who it served, which I always found fascinating. And when I was doing my research on my book Silence and Beauty, which is on Shusaku Endo's post-war masterpiece on persecution of Christians in the 17th century, I went back to Japan to do some research, and I encountered Kintsugi again there in a context of how Japanese see brokenness as sacred. And so, when something breaks, you don't throw it away because it has more history because it broke, and how somehow the shapes of the fragments are so unique unto each broken piece that there's a story that you can weave out of that shape. And so Kintsugi masters will create rivers and landscapes out of these, basically by using gold. And so it's more than just filling the cracks. It's really recreating something. And when I began to understand Christianity, I was really astonished that Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, he could have come back as anything. He's God after all. But he chose the human body, first of all, which is incredible to me that he would do that after all that he's been through, but that he also came back as a wounded human being, right? So his nail marks are still with him. And when I connected those two, when I was writing Art and Faith book, we didn't hit the pandemic yet, but we were, this book was published in the beginning of it, and I had a Kintsugi chapter which talked about that Japanese tradition connected with this mystery of Christ's post-resurrection appearance, and presumably forever he's going to carry those wounds. And I thought about the difference between the perfection of faith as Western perfection, this industrial perfection of, which we consider when we are talking about theology in Western circles, that is the assumption is that when Jesus says, be perfect as God is perfect, we're talking about perfection in the completed sense. But when we think about the imperfection of Christ, right, the wounds that he carried, perhaps that teleos, the perfection, is not so much industrial as it is who Christ is. And so Kintsugi became this theological reality for me as well. And isn't it amazing that Japan, which is so perhaps alien to Christian faith, held on to this idea that brokenness is sacred? Where did that come from? How is that part of Japanese, such a significant part of Japanese culture, to the extent that you may argue that Senna Rikyu, the great tea master, Urushi tradition, all of the art forms, the aesthetics of Japan is based on this brokenness as an entry point to, imperfection, immaculateness as an entry point into a journey toward the new.
You were commissioned to do a illustrated version of the King James Version. I think it was the 400th anniversary of the King James Version, and of the Four Gospels, and which is a spectacularly beautiful work. But I read that you, as you were doing that work, I think you would kind of like read a chapter a day and then illustrate that. But that you indicated that the single verse "Jesus wept" was one that was with you the whole time that you were doing all of that work.
Yeah.
Why do you think Jesus wept?
John 11:35, Jesus wept. 2 words, right? Really, even before this commission, which was released in 2011 for 400th anniversary of King James, I had been for decades before that. Perhaps in the mid-90s, I began to think this way. But I am literally painting with Jesus' tears. This brokenness of pulverized minerals and nikawa, which is the hide glue that's used in Japan. Mixture is water-based. And so things, tragedies, realities of brokenness, and and violence really in the world. I think it was heightened by Columbine high school shooting, and I just sensed something deeply Christ tears upon us. And so I began to paint, almost invoking that. And then 9/11 happened. You know, I'm a survivor of 9/11. I was trapped under the towers in a subway for 45 minutes. So it's a miracle that I am still here. But after that, I thought just over and over again what those two words mean. Jesus wept for my life, but also how to move forward in this time. Like, do you dare paint in such a time as this? And when I realized that I had the language to deal with my own trauma as well as the collective trauma that we were going through post 9/11. And then, so almost everything my book, Art Plus Faith as well, I note there that this is the pinhole, Jesus wept. And everything else flows out of that pinhole. And what I call theology of making is a way to try to understand somatic knowledge of theology through the lens of an artist, but also lens of God who sent his son to weep for us, right? To shed his own blood and sacrifice, so that in many sense it's through his tears that we find this new reality of hope. And so my art has always been a pursuit, process of trying to grasp the vastness of those two words. And you know, I thought I will move on at some point, you know, and I never did.
Huh. I mean, it's striking to me that you asked that question, that here you were trapped under some of the rubble, under the streets and the subway in 9/11, following September 11, and then asking yourself the question, does one dare paint at such a time as this? Mm-hmm. And one could ask that question in a sort of utilitarian fashion, right? Of, dare I paint? And if the answer is yes, then finding some sort of utilitarian end. I'm going to paint because such and so, I'll get to do such and so, or I'll communicate such and so. But what I heard you saying is not a utilitarian answer, but instead saying that you came to see that your work as an artist was itself an embodiment of the grief of God over the world, and thereby embodies, manifests hope in and of itself, not in a utilitarian fashion, but in and of itself. I don't know.
That's really a great angle to understand what I was going through, and I'm still going through that in some way. Utilitarian pragmatism, what I see as in the same way that industrial perfectionism has brought in this expectation of something being complete and perfect, is I would say is the direction opposite of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, Jesus weeping when Mary was weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. It's a profound reality of why would Son of God weep when he's about to resurrect Lazarus? He had the answer, but he chose to spend that moment not only being human, but being a friend who saw his friend's tears and was angry at that reality. And so that certainly wasn't utilitarian. I mean, utility would say, bring Mary, ye of little faith, right? Look at what I can do. But he didn't. He wasted time. He stopped and he felt deeply the grief of the moment. And so that, when I thought about that, something opened up for me, which is art, which has always been pushed toward utilitarian ends. That you have to have kind of this purpose-driven way of being an artist. If it's not useful, then why do it? And I look at art, William Blake, Emily Dickinson, Vincent van Gogh, great art that I admire, Frangelico, painting in the time of Black Plague. And I see something different. So I see something that is profoundly important for human beings to understand that our purpose on this earth is not fully utilitarian, although that's certainly part of what we do. But ultimately, meaning is given to us by understanding that feeling deeply about reality that is broken, right? And just like the Japanese, saying that ground zero, brokenness in front of us, is sacred. And it is here that we start our journey. And that understanding, to me, is so counter to this utilitarian pragmatism that our industrial nations, modern nations, have driven ourselves to master. But at the same time, isn't it what we need in our stress, in our anxiety, in this reality where meritocracy has driven us to this excellence, to beating the others. And yet if we don't recognize what we are grieving about, what is, even celebrating the imperfections in each other, in our communities, I don't think we will be able to find whatever it is ultimately fulfilling and enduring about ourselves.
Yeah, even the kintsugi, it acknowledges, it seems to me that art form acknowledges a sort of usefulness, a sort of utilitarian in the,
right.
It's pottery that once had a use,
yes.
But the beauty is beyond the use, right? It's a sort of it's broken. Its usefulness is transcended perhaps by a greater beauty, a greater end.
Yeah. It's still useful because you can serve tea. And urushi is very important art form because it is, perhaps, unlike chemical glues, that it's really alive and remains flexible, and it's waterproof, and you can serve tea again. But you're right that it goes way beyond that. If that was the only purpose, then why bother pouring gold on top or designing with the fractures? And these are spectacular designs. Sometimes there's a technique called makie, which uses pearl substance to create design, and I mean it just goes on and on. But it really is. You have to think about what is worthy, right? What makes something allow us to understand ourselves and our communities and our history. And it's certainly not by throwing it away and forgetting the past. And it's certainly not just because it's useful, but there's a sense of beholding, right? That allows us to, like Jesus, beholding Mary and beholding what's happening, Lazarus' death, fully without, before you do anything about it. And so that process reveals something about the nature of art. And by art, I mean all sorts of art, including, cooking and dancing. And all of us are artists in that sense, that we are driven to find that connection and meaning. And so it's a really interesting inflection point where we deal with, paradoxically, something that doesn't make sense, right? And something that we struggle with, we don't understand. And yet there is a way that somatically, by creating something that is enduring, you tap into that.
So with that sort of attentiveness to the brokenness of the world, you mentioned your own experience on September 11, but I also read that your grandfather was an observer to the horrors of Hiroshima.
Yeah, he was second in command at Education Department. He was sent to Hiroshima 2 weeks after to report to the government.
And how do you feel as if that experience of his has informed your sensibilities?
He never talked about it. My mother told me that he could never talk about the experience. But I sense, when my mother was alive, I sensed in her the weight of that experience. Trauma, being carried through generations, and struggles with anxiety and fear of the future. And I think for him, he dove into, he was, professor of education. So he dove into teaching science in a way that acknowledged the danger of research. And he had very much a moral perspective of, and as I found out later, he was an underground teacher of the Bible. He post-war in this Mukyokai, no church movement, which was basically like a discipleship group that met secretly, sometimes among the intellectual communities of Tokyo. And I think that was his way of addressing the trauma. But my mother, since she did not inherit that faith, at least until the end of her days, I didn't know about any of this until I started to look into the trauma of Japanese history of faith through Shusa Kendo's work, Silence. And as I wrote the book, I showed it to my mother, and she was like, "Oh, this makes sense because your grandfather's, these underground leaders." And so, "You never told me that, Mom." And my mom was like, "You never asked."
You had to write a book to learn these things about your family.
Exactly. Oh, it's mysterious, unveiling.
Yeah. So the obviously, as exhibited by Shusaku Endo and his book Silence, or then more recently, obviously, with World War II, these sort of grave traumas. And at the heart of that trauma, going in various directions, is the intertwining of Japanese traditional commitments and Christianity. And here you are, a Japanese American who's Christian, what do you do with all that? I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot to be carrying around. That plus your grandfather having been a witness to Hiroshima. It's like,
Yeah,
what do you do? What do you do with all of that?
Wow, you just paint, and perhaps you're right about it. But seriously though, painting allows me to, at least in being, accepting the mystery of it, that you will never fully comprehend. But somehow intuitively, I can capture all of that. That would be impossible to perhaps spell it out in a linear fashion. That somehow my hands, connected with these materials that I have come to love, and it will do that for me. And many times I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to know what I'm doing, because in the studio, I have this liturgy basically of creating something with this deeper somatic knowledge that my rational side, in the beginning, you try to understand everything, and at some point you give up because you're painting something, and then 3 years later, that painting is shown somewhere in a gallery or museum, and somebody comes across it and tells me things that I am saying clearly in the painting, but I never thought that I would be able to access. It's this mysterious thing that happens. And so I have come to trust the process and not to question it or to force certain ways of messaging perhaps through the work, because I think my process of painting, the slow method, allows me to somehow bring in all of what I am struggling with, what I am rejoicing about, what I am, what I'm really questioning to God, why, or how, even the complexity of my own feelings, which is sometimes hard to explain. In canvas and paper and silk in front of me, I can somehow express that.
So you've spoken of culture care, and you have spoken of culture care as a non-violent resistance against culture wars, which is a fascinating, provocative way to put it, I think. So would you unpack that some for us?
Right. Culture wars, a term that sociologist James Davison Hunter coined, I believe as early as 80s. He was talking about these, and he wrote a book called Culture Wars, and he's a friend of mine, and tells me that he never expected that word to become a culture itself. But here we are. And actually in his book, he predicted that the polarization and demonization of these two sides of political spectrum would end up being paralyzed. And people take advantage of that, that gap. And we will not be able to, we would end up defending things that we never thought we would be defending. Well, that's exactly what's happening. And when I was a National Council member working with poet Dana Gioia, in the midst of the cultural wars, they wanted to eliminate the NEA. The conservatives were lobbying to get rid of it, and Dana, who is a conservative in terms of his politics, was appointed by President Bush to just deal with, to calm the storms in some way. He was literally told that you are the sacrificial lamb to the altar of culture wars. And ended up in his term probably the most successful NEA chair that we've ever had in terms of programs, initiatives. He worked with public sector to create everything from Poetry Out Loud, which is still going on, to Shakespeare in American Communities, to Big Read, to all these programs that has transformed jazz masters, transformed how we view culture. And I try to explain to my friends what was happening, like what is the strategy? Even your own family don't want you to be doing this, kind of thing. Like, how do you do this? And I said, it's like caring for culture rather than demonizing, and a friend of mine who was an editor said, well, you should write on culture care. So that became kind of its own coined term. But the culture care is this, that we have to change the metaphor about culture. It is not a battleground to fight over. It is a ecosystem to steward, a garden to take care of. If you have a garden, a patch of land that you share, let's say a public garden, you don't really care what the person's political views are. You care that the person has great tomatoes. You want to learn from that person, right? And that's culture. Culture is about fruitfulness. And so we have twisted and convinced ourselves that culture is dangerous, first of all. So we have to defend our turf. And we have to get guns and, whatever we need to protect it. But if it's a soil to tend to and so that when you plant seeds that it will take root and grow, that it's a generative source that all of us need to feed upon that abundance, then it's a different mindset, You can disagree with your neighbor about that, but you care most about the fruit. And if there's fruitfulness, then we should go there and learn from that person. And that attitude will also allow us to enjoy beauty, to see that hard work can create something that is delicious and beautiful. And it's for everyone to enjoy, And so artists who tend to be conscripted into the front lines of culture wars, have expressed to me, that that's not what they're interested in at all, right? They want to play music. They want to create fruit. But we've been treating them as soldiers rather than gardeners. And they're struggling because of that. So this also, by the way, happens in churches, right? So many artists who, are part of a church tradition, they feel exiled from the very culture that sees culture as a battleground. Because they sense something wrong with this picture, because they're trying to create fruitfulness, but their church is not helping them to understand it that way, or to, you can do certain things like Dana Gioia did, in this very divisive place. Why the arts can speak into, not only that divide, or maybe into the divide, just like a kintsugi master, but there's beauty in disagreements. There's beauty. I mean, look at Shakespeare, right? These are great examples of how we can learn to speak, even though we may at times be violently, in disagreement. There's something profound about the arts, which allows us to transcend the barriers that we have erected in fear at all times, in anxiety. And on stage where jazz musicians are playing, that's not the most important thing.
That leads us beautifully to a last question. You say at one point, art is always transgressive, and we need to transgress in love. And then you go on to say, we today have a language that celebrates waywardness, but we do not have a cultural language to bring people back home. Everything I do has something to do with that. So as a close, kind of give us a little bit of commentary about that.
Yeah, so we often associate transgression as something that is associated with sinfulness, especially in religious communities. And obviously I'm not talking about sinning more, but transgression in terms of crossing the boundary and willingness to take risks and establish conventional norm, when the established conventional norm is this polarized, divisive culture wars, schism. When the ceramic vessel is broken, then you don't really ask, is it broken? Mm-hmm. And the kintsugi master looks at the brokenness and in a sense brings that to a realm of aesthetic value. But we don't, so that person is transgressing against the normative reality of a ceramic bowl. And in that sense, what artists can do and what we have been taught or trained to do is to see beyond the survival mode, the mechanism that in our educational system, we train everybody to simply put your blinders on and see what is in front of you and solve that problem. Mm. And what artists have learned to do is transgress against that, remove the blinders and see the whole in panoramic vision. Sometimes it's to the detriment of survival because you're not paying attention sometimes to what you need to. But artists throughout ages, have proven that what they have done, because they see more and they are willing to take that risk to transgress beyond what they have created, right, has become something that is enduring and something that is invaluable to our experience many, many years later. So Vincent van Gogh, Emily Dickinson, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, all these people, in a sense, pushed against the normative conventionalities of their days and created a form that speaks into their reality. But at the same time, that act of love has given us this gift that we are able to see through and learn from and grow from, because they feed our souls in that sense, and they allow us to see our time of severe, distrust and brokenness and betrayals. Little bit from a perspective of what these great artists were able to create and gift to our time, so that we can perhaps rise above what is happening in front of us, and not so much, we can be concerned and we can be anxious about the future, but these masterpieces allow us to live in our present, to see our time better, to ask questions that perhaps we have failed to focus on because we are so divided and we're so focused on this limited perspective.
Talking to Makoto Fujimura here in his beautiful gallery in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Thank you, Mako, for having us. It's been a wonderful, lovely conversation. Thank you.
So great to have this. Thank you.
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Emily Seiner, Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.